Yeah. Definitely an investigation. Maybe there's yeah. Oh, great. Yeah. Really looking forward to stuff. Are you going to summer? Yeah. No, para asegurarme que la que coordine que esté acá va. Eso es cierto. No, es
I'm in a bit of a writing process. Okay. Sometimes you can hate it when it happens. Just trying to publish good.
Yo te he escuchado, pues,
Especially there's really bueno, and so, you know, you put a paper number, but I know what yeah, oh, yes. It's just different, you know. It really can't do it. You sort of have to stretch some muscles. Usually go. Negocios. Yeah, no, I know. Negocios. Especially because we've standardized our work so much, right? That it's sometimes hard to find different ways of communicating ideas. Tenses. Yeah.
Oh, no. I don't know. It's like, also like,
But I was also thinking, man, because it's a really good, but things that you can't have writers. Right, you have to write. Right, you have to tell a story. You have to write. What do you do when you're
like last two class. So I don't know.
Looks like never happened. But I think it's not. Already, I have meanings. Yeah, that's it's private, I understand. It doesn't say that. But it's now we're just good. Yeah, I think we use.
Me quito el puesto.
Yes, probably gonna wanna move. Yeah. First semester. So you got the bad. You're always welcome to see here. This was a class that was really focusing on getting was all paid for by the person. Which was insane. I would like a high school teacher once in a while. So they have this. I'm happy to. They have other things to do. Sorry, to see you. This one. Responsibility. Nothing happens. Very kind. They don't do great for it.
Claro. Entonces yo siento como que trae la alegría pero ellos van a vivir. Sí, la idea siempre es comprar casa. Tiene carrera profesional, entonces es más carrera, es activa.
We'll see. You're leaving, right? You're leaving.
No te pagan al año. Al año.
Alright, so my original contract.
People that open in Paris. No, sí.
Ahora
No, yo creo que sí.
Como que hablé con ella. Wait, so that happened. Well, I guess you're gonna teach. But I'm not. This time.
sorry.
I mean, you can have
I mean. Yeah. If I never had so much.
Significantly less.
It doesn't matter. You know, it's 2 years. You better not get
I know. But I'm not sure they don't think
All right, welcome. Thanks for being here. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Tad Danning to Notre Dame and the Hello. Tad is Robson Professor of Political Science at the University of California at Berkeley, where he also directs the Center on the Politics of Development. Pretty hard to describe all the contributions that Tad has made to political science, social science more broadly, so I'm going to be brief. But really, in a very short period of time, he has made transformational contributions to many big questions, but also to how we conduct social science research. Let me mention a few. Tad published 4 books that are absolutely foundational on the respective topics. On democratization, his book, Crude Democracy, Natural Resource Wealth, and Political Regimes, published by Cambridge in 2008, appends the conventional wisdom that oil is a curse by showing that actually under certain conditions it can help democratization. And that won the best book from APSA democratization section. On clientelism, his co-author book with Sue Stokes, Valeria Brucco, and Marcelo Nazareno, Brokers, Voters, and Clientelism, The Puzzle of Distributed Politics, published by Cambridge in 2013. offers the most systematic conceptual framework, a theory to explain the emergence and death of clientelism and a wealth of evidence. Really is, I think, the most important book on clientelism as well. That won the Best Book Award from APSA's Comparative Democratization and Comparative Politics sections. On accountability, Tad has done very influential work on how citizens may or may actually not punish corruption by politicians. A few weeks ago, Enrique Seira gave a talk on this topic. Actually, we're talking about the findings from that research. The book associated with that also won the Best APSA Award for experiments. That has also made perhaps the most, or at least found the most convincing evidence on the positive effect of cross-cutting cleavages on democracy, especially in ethnic diverse settings. You know, an idea that goes all the way back to Madison. Those are two American political science review pieces. Lastly, equally important are Tad's contributions to how we do social science research. His book, Natural Experiments for the Social Sciences, has really influenced and disseminated the use of causal inference in political science, social science. A lot of what we see published in top journals, but also in a lot of the very good dissertations coming out of Notre Dame right now, really bear the imprint of Tad's work on natural experiments. And today he's going to present a future award-winning book on the role of slavery helping or not state capacity development in Brazil in the 19th century. So that welcome to the table. Thanks for being here. Thank you.
Enormously kind introduction, Luis. I appreciate it. It's so nice to see friends here, and it's really such a pleasure to be at Notre Dame. I came in, I think, 2010 or 11, and then for a fellowship for David Collier here. But it's really given the tremendous strength, especially of faculty in Latin American politics here, and across all areas. But it's really a visit to the source here. So thanks for having me to present this work. And I don't know about award-winning book, but I would emphasize very future. And so I'm going to present work in progress, and looking forward to getting your ideas and suggestions for how to develop this work as we move forward. So freedom in the deep state, slavery, state capacity, and institutional change in the Americas. And so let me say that if you were to think about slave states like Brazil's in the 19th century, or other countries across the Americas, you would with very good reason think about what you might call a seigneurial state, a state that is aiding slave owners, working at the behest of slave owners, adopting policy that's in the interest of slave owners. And that was absolutely the case across the Americas, and we saw states that engaged in tremendous violence and coercion in support of private violence and coercion across the Americas. But also in 19th century Brazil and other cases, I'll argue, at times we see a state that sometimes acted autonomously of the interests of slave-owning elites. And so as one indicator of that, let me draw here on interesting work by Kayla Grinberg here, who plots decisions in the trial courts among cases, in the cases she researched, cases that eventually reached the appeals court of Rio de Janeiro. And these are cases that explicitly had to do with manumission. So these were freedom suits, and I'm plotting here the proportion of cases decided in favor of freedom or in favor of the interests of slave owners. See, quite interestingly, both in the trial court plotted here and also in the appeals court, quite similar rates of decisions in favor of freedom. I would say surprisingly high rates, perhaps at first glance, decisions in favor of freedom. And similar patterns appear in the appeals court in the cases she studied, but it's not the case that the same cases were decided in the same way at both levels of the judiciary that she studied. So there's quite a lot of variation, in fact, in how individual judges were viewing cases of freedom. And her work and some work of other historians that I'll draw on has really opened up our understanding of the institutions that regulated slavery in Brazil and other societies. When I was an undergraduate working with Thomas Skidmore, who's a Brazilian historian, the idea was that all the archives had been burned. And in Brazil, Rui Barroso was the Minister of the Interior after the establishment of the Republic, And the idea, what I heard at the time is that you can't study slavery in Brazil, the archives are burned. That turns out not to be the case. In fact, there's a rich archival record that historians have been drawing on, particularly the last 20 years, and that Gayla Grinberg exploits here. Okay, so this raises some quite, I think, important and interesting questions. Variations in the success of petitions of enslaved persons and their increasing prevalence in the 19th century, in particular, raise questions first about when and why the state is seigneurial, i.e. beholden to economic elites, to slave-owning elites, or instead sometimes autonomous of their interests. And secondly, how did the state adjudicate competing claims? For example, one big issue that characterized a lot of the jurisprudence in the 19th century was about the just price at which enslaved persons could purchase their freedom. This, by the way, preceded the law that formally gave enslaved persons the right to purchase their freedom in Brazil in 1871. And so adjudicating those claims involved a large bureaucracy, in fact. And so the question is how that shaped the size, scope, and nature of the bureaucracy in Brazil. And what I want to propose is that the construction of the autonomous state in Brazil was driven by conflicting commitments to liberty and property that couldn't be readily or always resolved in the legislative arena. This relates to a debate in the study of slavery about the contrast between the Brazilian case and other cases in Latin America, in particular in the Americas, in particular the French and English cases. Tannenbaum in 1946 wrote a great book that raised a great question about the contrast between the Brazilian case and the Spanish American cases and the French and English cases on the other hand. He pointed to the role of Roman law and the absence of a formal civil code in promoting manumission in Brazil. So Brazil's a case that had very high rates of manumission relative, for example, to the North American cases, to the French cases as well after the passage of the Code Noir in the French colonies. But it's also the case that both opponents and proponents of improving the so-called lot of slaves appealed to Roman law. And so what I want to argue here is that the explanation for the emergence of an autonomous bureaucracy that decided in favor of freedom in Brazil was not ideological in the sense that Tannenbaum argued, but instead was political. It had in particular to do with the fact that conflicting commitments to liberty and property couldn't be readily or always resolved in the legislative arena. And so what I want to argue is that reform was, to some extent, enabled through bureaucratic appointment. So you can think about reform by so the imperial state in general and Emperor Dom Pedro II in particular faced substantial political constraints on abolitionist legislation. This was the conflict in 19th century Brazil, as in so many American societies. And as a result, the empire delegated much latitude to its bureaucracy, which often advanced policy well before the formal ratification by the legislature. This can be seen in the decisions of the judiciary. I'll talk about that today, and sometimes even in the carceral system. So I'll talk about ongoing research in that bit. So in this sense, conflict over abolition boosted the growth and character of the bureaucratic state. Indeed, eventual formal abolition was credibly responsible for the fall of the monarchy and the instauration of the republic in 1889 in Brazil. And so formal legislation faced substantial political elements. But reform by bureaucratic stealth sometimes did not in quite the same way. That's what I want to argue. So that's the overall orientation of this project, or at least this portion of this project. This is ongoing work, as I mentioned, and my goal today is a little more modest. So I want to present some evidence and describe ongoing data collection on the two faces of the Brazilian regulatory slave state in two spheres, the judiciary and the prison system. And then, having done that, I think that'll get at some of the ideas that I was just mentioning, then consider some implications for theories of state formation and state capacity as well as institutional change. So both some theoretical and substantive implications that might come out of this work. So a substantial, as I mentioned, judicial and bureaucratic apparatus was required to handle freedom suits in imperial Brazil. So in particular, the courts named trustees called curadores, to represent enslaved persons in freedom suits and other kinds of civil proceedings. They appointed expert witnesses, for example, to arbitrate the just price in cases of what was called coartation. Stuart Schwartz had written about this famously as early as the 70s, weighed the property interests of heirs against the demands for liberty of the enslaved, and sometimes limited the activities to which enslaved persons working for their own accounts, the so-called escravos chigoni, could be forcefully put. And so there was a substantial economy that involved the accumulation of private earnings over long periods of time, especially in urban slavery, that was part of the process of coartation or purchase of freedom by enslaved persons. That process was, of course, was rife for abuse by private slave owners, and the courts played an important role in adjudicating cases of freedom suits in this period in Brazil. So just to give an idea of how important slavery was as an issue in the judiciary, this plots the proportion of freedom suits and the proportion of cases related to slavery that reached the Supreme Court in Brazil based on Almeida source in the 19th century. And one can see that, the proportion of those suits related to slavery reached 20%, 30% by the end of the imperial period. So it was certainly an important question that was facing the Supreme Court, but also courts at every level throughout the judicial system. And the courts were asked to weigh in on a wide range of questions having to do with the legality of claims to freedom and other aspects involved with slavery. This isn't meant for you necessarily to read, but what is quite interesting to see here, as we saw, is also kind of intimated in discussing Grinberg's work, is that there's substantial variation across judges in pro-freedom or pro-slavery decisions. And so this lists all the Supreme Court justices in Brazil and codes their votes on cases that had to do with slavery, that were in which they could take a pro-freedom or pro-slavery vote. And we see variation over time, but also variation both within and across judges. So the blue dots are pro-freedom votes and the red dots are pro-slavery votes. And I think that understanding the politics of this variation, if you will, is really critical to trying to unpack the broader politics of what I want to call bureaucracy by stealth. So oops, sorry. Here we go. The emperor appointed presidents. So Dom Pedro II had more margin over the careers of presidents of the Supreme Court. The rest of the ministers were appointed by seniority rules. And so his margin of influence over them may have been less. So one of the ongoing pieces of work in this project is to look at the career trajectories of judges at lower levels of the judicial bureaucracy and try to assess the relationship between their pro-freedom decisions and their subsequent career paths. We're starting here with the highest echelon, partly just for reasons of data availability. I'll talk more about that later. But trying to assess what might have influenced Supreme Court justices in a pro-freedom direction. And the hypothesis is that Dom Pedro II himself played a role in exercising pressure over presidents in a pro-freedom direction. So this is just a little bit of evidence on that. So this shows the votes of presidents appointed directly by the emperor versus ordinary Supreme Court ministers on freedom votes. So we have three categories here: the votes of presidents during their terms, the votes of presidents prior to becoming presidents, but while they were ministers of the Supreme Court and non-presidents. And what you do see is descriptively a difference, an important difference between presidents and non-presidents, particularly presidents acting during their term. So they're 17 percentage points more likely to cast a pro-freedom vote to decide in a pro-freedom direction than ordinary ministers. One of the things we thought was that this might work through selection, that ministers who voted in a pro-freedom direction would tend to be appointed at higher levels, at higher rates to the presidency of the Supreme Court. That doesn't seem to be borne out in this evidence, at least. The difference between the voting behavior of presidents before their term and non-presidents is small and not statistically significant standard test. So that doesn't seem to hold a lot of water. What we've been exploring is other mechanisms through which the emperor may have exerted pressure on presidents during their terms. So one of the things we've been looking at is the awarding of decorations, titles, condecoraciones to presidents, and found some evidence that those who voted in at higher rates in the pro-freedom direction were more decorated by Don Pedro II. So I'm not going to present that here, but that's something that we've been working on. And then the other thing to note is that there's some variation across presidents, which also draws down the average of the overall difference between presidents and non-presidents. This one may also be slightly hard to read, but it plots the voting records of all the presidents before their presidency and during their presidency, and compares it to other ministers in the same period. While there are some outliers, i.e. presidents who did not vote in favor of in the pro-freedom direction, the preponderance of presidents voted at quite a bit higher rates than non-presidents in the pro-freedom direction, both before their terms and especially after. And so I draw your attention to presidents, for example, who cast nearly 100% of a substantial number of votes in a pro-freedom direction during their presidency. On the fifth row, Joaquim Marcelino Tibritu, for example, 94% or 32 out of 34 votes in a pre-freedom direction, compared to only 66% votes among the other ministers. So presidents were appointed by the emperor and possibly subject to various mechanisms of influence were voting at a much higher level. I mentioned that we found evidence that pro-freedom judges received titles at higher rates, also than those who voted against freedom at higher rates. So this is one portion of this ongoing work. We're in the process of gathering and coding voting records for judges at lower levels. It all is kind of painstaking. These are handwritten 19th century judicial documents. They're not all centralized. They're often in districts. AI doesn't help us much, sadly. So there's it's quite a lot of slow work to gather it all together. That's the ambition, is to try to get cases at the lower level and see, kind of at least descriptively, if patterns of promotion are associated with decisions of those lower court judges. Okay, so I also want to present some ongoing data collection work on the carceral system. So I think this probably presents a hard case for the argument that there was autonomy in the judicial bureaucracy, because if any dimension of the bureaucracy is going to be seigneurial in the sense of acting at the behest of slave owners, I think it would be the prison system. And indeed, there are many, many ways in which that was true. And so while rural slavery tended to rely more on private coercion, this was much less the case in the cities. In fact, what the seigneurial carceral state persecuted and repressed what it saw as disorder, and even whipped enslaved persons at the request of their masters for a price. So in the Calabozo in Rio de Janeiro, for example, this was public punishment of enslaved persons, where the state is acting very much at the behest of and in the interest of slave owners. But also, An autonomous carceral state, so an imperial police that sometimes also became an ally of enslaved persons. And so what I'm using here is archival evidence from prisoner registers of enslaved prisoners at the house of detention of the court, which was a more transitory prison. And match them to judicial records to investigate this theme. This is an example of a entry from the list of matriculations at the Casa de Detenção. This is Teresa. I'm going to have a translation here, Teresa. So all of these entries are similar. They list the enslaved person's name, first name only, sometimes an indicator of ethnic or geographic origin. So Teresa Conga would have meant she was born in Africa, on the coast of Africa. Often the designations were wildly inaccurate in terms of the specific part of Africa that enslaved persons came from, but that would indicate African origin. Slave of João Ferreira de Carvalho, imprisoned for, and this is key in the records that quite interestingly, around 15 in one period, 20% of the records in another show prisoners in this period coming to the authorities to complain about their master, queixar-se do seu senhor, or sometimes asking for sponsorship, apadrinhamento do chefe da polícia. So this was a quite common notation where people would come to complain. And what's interesting is that although the record themselves, the sort of formulaic aspects of the record don't record much detail on what happened in the cases, and so they mainly record, the age, civil status, appearance of the enslaved person. Sometimes the marginal notes give a lot of hints about what happened. And so in this case, for example, on the right-hand side, Teresa was passed to the disposal of a welfare judge, on the 28th of May, 1881, by order of the chief of police. Unfortunately, on the 16th of the same month, she was freed and delivered to João Ferreira de Carvalho, so her slave owner. So she had an unsuccessful appeal. But in other cases, here's Antonia, passed to the disposition of the judge of Providencia on the 11th of June, 1881, by order of the same date by the chief of police. Passed to back to the disposition of the chief of police on the 30th of September, 1881, by the order of the judge, who judged her free, using the term liberta here, which in the language of the time meant a freed enslaved person. So she was not freed in the sense of being emancipated from prison. She was freed in the sense of being emancipated as a formerly enslaved, now free person. But also lots of other interesting cases. I won't go into all of them, but here's Jose, who was an African freed without appeal. Jose Benguela means he was born in a region of current day Angola, ostensibly, but of African origin, born in Africa, passed to the disposition of the welfare judge on 31st of May, then passed to back to the disposition of the chief of police, who again judged him free. And then I had thought I'd put in, Loroncino. Yeah, I skipped over Loroncino here. Loroncino passed to the disposition of the chief of police and also judged free. Here's a case of a freed minor. So Loroncino was 10 years old at the time that he was picked up. He wasn't imprisoned for complaining about his master, but imprisoned for walking around lost. So these kinds of cases appeared. And what's quite interesting is that these cases can be traced. And so one of the things that have been doing, is to trace the progress of these cases in the judicial system. So we've been able to identify some of these cases. Sometimes when an enslaved person was judged to have been abandoned, that is, the slave owner didn't present themselves in the Casa de Detenção, There was a notice that was published in the newspaper. We found a bunch of those. And and then the enslaved person was freed on the basis of the claim that he or she had been abandoned. So all of these cases, though, in one way or another, involve the sponsorship of the chief of police. So these are cases, some of these are cases where enslaved persons appeal to the imperial state to complain about mistreatment by their masters. And so in this difficult case where one would expect the seigneurial face of the state to be especially strong, the police chief's patronage suggests the double face, the Janus face of the nature of the state in this case, even of its repressive arm. So as we've seen, and as we're starting to analyze more systematically, the chief sometimes freed enslaved persons after resorting to the formal judicial system. There might have been many reasons for many bases for these claims. And so one was that, and we show, I show you that a higher proportion of claimants were African born and brought to Brazil after the slave trade was first legally banned. So the slave trade was banned in 1831, but ineffectively it wasn't effectively banned until 1850. But that created one legal avenue for appeals, possibly. And so we've looked at some judicial cases that bear this out, but that's kind of a hypothesis for continued investigation that would have provided a window for appeals. Also, enslaved persons left in the prisons, as I mentioned, could be judged abandoned after an ad was placed in newspapers and then freed by a judge. So what's useful about looking at the text of these cases is that they often illustrate the conflict between seigneurial interests and the bureaucratic state. And so the text of the judicial cases suggests both the conflict of slave owners and the role of bureaucratic discretion. So just a few examples. One slave owner complained that his slave had been referred to the judiciary due to a whim of the chief of police's authority, capricho. A whim of authority, which I think captures nicely the spirit. Another argued that the chief of police arbitrarily and falsely listed the slave Sophia as abandoned so that she could be judged free. So as I say, these cases illustrate this bureaucratic, this conflict between the seigneurial state and a more autonomous bureaucracy that was emerging in this realm. So overall, the archival records indicate a police bureaucracy that sometimes acted autonomously of and in conflict with the expressed interests of slave owners. And so this had important consequences, one of which is difficult to document comparatively cross-nationally in a reliable way, but that is quite obvious from looking at urban records in Brazil, that manumission was much higher in Brazil than in other cases, but also that manumission in the carceral system, along with those in the judicial system, contributed to the high rate of freed persons in imperial Brazil. Okay, so I know those of you hungry for evidence and the estimation of causal effects won't yet be totally satisfied with the evidence we've been able to gather so far. But I think this is contributing to an understanding of the bureaucratic politics and the way that those bureaucratic politics enabled a movement in the abolitionist direction, even as legislation remained strongly entrenched in the other direction. So I want to say a few things about what I think some of the implications of that might be. So one is that I think quite oddly, many theories of state formation in Latin America at least appear to neglect the role of slavery. And so there's not much discussion comparatively in this literature on slavery. But of course, slavery was perhaps the most important institution in colonial and imperial Brazil. And in many parts of the Americas. Everything in Brazil depended on slavery. There was no sector of the economy untouched by slavery, and that was really the foundation of the Brazilian colonial experience, but also the imperial period in the 19th century that I'm studying here. So I find that odd, but also we have some very rich and wonderful and good accounts that do consider slavery's influence, but that rightly, I think, in many ways, emphasize the seigneurial state. And so Mizuka's book, for example, discusses the unifying impact among elites of the fear of slave result and how this contributed to a centralizing tendency, support for a centralizing state building project, where the state would ostensibly supply troops to put down slave revolt in exchange for acquiescence to a centralizing bargain. But I think that story is somewhat complicated by the Janus-based nature of the state in imperial Brazil, in particular, the fact that the emperor was balancing a virulently anti-abolitionist slave-owning class with a whole suite of subtler measures that in fact were moving in an abolitionist direction. And so the periods that are pointed to for the consolidation of central control, the reign of Dom Pedro II, and particularly after 1850, were precisely the periods in which the bureaucracy was moving away from the seigneurial direction. So I think just for understanding state formation in Latin America, the questions that the observation of a Janus-based state raises are important for considering. Also, there's the question of elite conflict. So in fact, José Murilo de Carvalho is probably the best known work on kind of the construction of the Brazilian state in the 19th century. And he pointed to the critical role of magistrates in imperial Brazil. So going off to Coimbra first in Portugal, and then later going to law school in São Paulo or Recife was the source of elite cohesion, according to Murilo de Carvalho. Lawyers were trained in the same general legal ideology, positivist legal ideology, and also socialized in a way that provided a source of elite cohesion, which was critical given potential regional fractionalism in Brazil. Also, the judiciary was a primary source for the political class. So many legislators started their careers as judges, sometimes went between the judicial and legislative realm. But it's also the case that perhaps a primary activity of this legal and political apparatus at the end of the colonial period and during the imperial period was the regulation of slavery in different ways. And as we've seen, there was substantial conflict among elites, very substantial variation in the judicial state's response to petitions from enslaved people, and substantial elite conflict. So I think that takes us closer to the more recent kind of historical political economy literature on how elite conflict can either contribute to or undermine state formation. Similarly, in important ways to the claims that are emerging from my research here, also foster the appearance of the rule of law in Latin America, as Franco Vivanco has shown for colonial Mexico. And so that's quite interesting that elite conflict can lead to these forms of state consolidation and state building in different realms. I think we have relatively little evidence on how conflict shaped the emergence of the regulatory and bureaucratic states. So I think that's studying the way in which reform was accomplished by bureaucratic stealth can help us understand that form of state building. That also leads to a focus on variation across the organs of the state, across bureaucrats working in the same state. I think that's really an important theme. It comes out a lot in this work on the 19th century. I'm not yet trying to trace the legacies, any contemporary legacies of that, but I think that point about divergence in bureaucratic capacity across different realms is something we may often miss. And so that's reminiscent of contemporary divergences in bureaucratic capacity. If you read about state building in Brazil now, O'Donnell here in the House of O'Donnell, many scholars will emphasize the brown areas, so to speak, as O'Donnell called them, where the state does not effectively penetrate. But others highlight pockets of efficiency, bolsões de eficiência, or autonomous but socially embedded bureaucracies. And so that variation, I think, is not well understood. We see similar kinds of variation in bureaucratic behavior across different realms in the imperial period, and that may raise the question of legacies across the imperial in the contemporary period. Okay, so that's one thing. State formation, I think, is one area that I think looking at this in this area can help shed light on. Another is the nature of institutional change. And so what's quite interesting, I find, about this period is that consistent with perhaps with Murillo-Coelho's emphasis on the important status of magistrates, maybe we see reform happening in the bureaucracy before reaching the legislature. So the argument I want to make is that the legislature faced political constraints that the bureaucracy didn't to the same degree. But what that meant is that policy was actually made in the bureaucracy. So there are lots of examples of this from the 19th century. So the arbitration of the fair price, as I mentioned, that was enshrined in legislation in 1871. There were cases throughout the 19th century that reached both the Supreme Court and that were decided at lower levels of the judicial bureaucracy about the just price, the price at which an enslaved person could purchase his or her freedom and how that could be arbitrated. There were many categories of police repression that actually preceded their adoption in any penal code. The Penal Code, for example, of 1891. One instance that I see a lot in these lists is repression of capoeiristas or capoeiras who were at the time, may be familiar now with the Afro-Brazilian martial art dance form called capoeira. But at the time, capoeiras were urban gangs, essentially, maltas. And so there was a constant, they were constantly subject to police repression. This is long before capoeira was formally outlawed in the 1991 Penal Code. And even abolition itself can be, I would argue, seen as the legal apotheosis of a long bureaucratic process. Okay, so I think thinking about reform by stealth helps us think about those aspects of institutional change as well. Okay, and then lastly, I think there are, and this is where I'd really like to go with this project, there are implications for the comparative study of slavery. So as I mentioned, Tannenbaum contrasted the Portuguese and Spanish colonies with the French and the English. And I think Tannenbaum, if you go back and look at that book, it's really quite an interesting question that he's asking. I think he's quite wrong in the answer. And I think also that, it gets a bad name because he starts, justifiably and rightly, it gets a bad name because he starts in some ways from the position of Gilberto Freire, the sort of the idea of racial democracy in Brazil and the contrast of more idyllic, harmonious race relations in Brazil with the North American case, for example. And so that's a complicated starting point because the reality is more complicated. But he asks an important question that's based in what I think is right about the different role and extent of manumission in the Brazilian and to a lesser extent Spanish American cases compared to the North American and Portuguese cases. But he attributes the differences to legal tradition, which I think is wrong. As I mentioned, it doesn't readily explain the greater extent of manumission in Brazil. Inter alia, because both advocates and proponents of, both advocates and critics, of freedom, both pointed to the same passages of Roman law or the Philippine ordinances through which they were transmitted. And so the contrast, explaining, I think, the contrast with the French and English colonies is a really important ambition, and I don't have the answer yet, or even a proposed answer. But the United States also had important examples of the participation of enslaved persons in market economies. Looking at that literature through the lens of the Brazilian experience is quite interesting in that way. So Golden, for example, in her book on urban slavery, talks about this a lot. Carpenter in his recent book on petitioning, and historians like Schweniger who have studied freedom suits demonstrate both their importance and the surprising degree of success, especially in the Upper South. But what happened in the US, as in the French colonies after the early adaptation of the Code Noir, was that that legislators sharply limited and even punished manumission. And so that made manumission, it was really that the legal legislative move that made manumission so scarce towards the end of the period of legal slavery in the United States, especially in the Deep South. In some British colonies, like when the British were in Demerara, the consent of the governor and council was required to liberate any individual enslaved person. In most of the British colonies, unlike Brazil, heavy taxes were imposed on manumission. So there were political economy choices and policy choices that affected the degree of manumission, yet it's not the case that ideology cleanly explains this difference or the tradition of Roman law. So I think thinking about that in comparative perspective is what I'm up to in this project, and I'd really welcome feedback and thoughts about that. In the project, in the argument I've proposed here, it's not so much the furtherance of slavery that built the state, but its gradual undoing. This did not, however, take the form of overt and militarized conflict. So Bensel has written about state building in the wake of the Civil War in the US. This is a very different kind of process. The challenge, I think, comparatively is to understand why repression built the state in certain ways in certain places, but regulation of slavery built a state that was relatively autonomous of slave owning elites in others. And so this is a form, what I've highlighted here is a form of state building against elites in which the autonomous state is built, if not exactly by stealth, then through bureaucratic action that's harder to observe and less politically perilous than, for example, through legislation. Okay, so that's kind of the conclusion in the research agenda. The slave state in Brazil was extremely violent and repressive, but the locations of violence and repression varied, as did the state's relationship with the interests of masters. The implications of this variation are, I think, underestimated in theories of state formation, and I think can contain intriguing ramifications for theories of institutional change. So what I really want to do is to try to help continue to explain this variation both in Brazil, but I hope in comparative perspective. So really would, at this stage in the project, welcome any feedback, critiques, but feedback of all forms, including on framing and the research questions, as well as the evidence that we've been able to look at so far. I think I'm exactly at 1:15, so that was good. Thank you.
So we open for questions. Michael?
Yeah, thanks Ed for an interesting talk. It just made me, I don't know much about all of this stuff, so I'm just curious about a couple of things I hope we can elaborate on. One is, how did slaves get into a position where they were able to, petition for freedom? And I'm wondering if some of those cases, as in the United States, were cases of free people of color being seized and forced into slavery, these slaves trying to force people into slavery and then they ended up being the process because they happen to come into police control. The second question is completely different. What was the understanding of the role of the legislature and the empire? I wouldn't expect you're saying the legislature wasn't able to do anything about these issues. But would anyone have expected the legislature to do anything contrary to what the emperor would want? Because this was still an empire. It had not had a glorious revolution asserting parliamentary supremacy over the crown. And, my expectation, not being a historian of Brazil, would be that this is like an authoritarian legislature that was used more as a way of co-opting and recruiting elites that were favorable to the regime and kind of rubber stamping what it wanted. Anyway, but there must be more to the story than that. So
Yeah,
please enlighten us.
Great questions. Thank you so much. And thanks again for coming. The routes to engaging in the routes to both judicial and non-judicial means of obtaining freedom were multiple. So that sometimes, as you say, there are cases of persons unjustly enslaved. And many of the cases, in fact, involve claims that somebody was unjustly enslaved, and the court got to adjudicate that. But there was also a big urban economy. So over the course of 10, 15, 20 years, an enslaved person could put aside a peculio, it's in the language of the 1871 law, which was an essay for purchasing freedom that was very prevalent. Wills and testaments were a big source of disputes over freedom. So people were often, enslaved persons were often liberated in a will or a testament, but sometimes and quite often with conditions. So serve me until the end of my days. But then there was some dispute that happened about what the end of the days meant, and did it include the spouse or not include the spouse, or, you know, the endless kinds of issues that could come up, which were all adjudicated in the judiciary. I mean, all of those kinds of issues were adjudicated in the judiciary. So there were lots of paths to disputes. And that meant that the legal issues were really quite substantial because of that. And, you know, there was a tradition also unconditional granting of manumission. So that's a little bit outside the scope of what I've been talking about here, but that did happen. And it, you know, probably was more prevalent culturally in Brazil than other places. So I don't want to completely discount the cultural argument. You know, at the baptismal font, you know, the child of a enslaved person would serve the family for decades, was liberated. So that kind of thing happened as well. But then claims would come up later by other members of the family, for example, that contested the original freeing. So lots of sources. For the legislature, yeah, I mean, yes, I take the point, the emperor had a lot of influence for sure. But he faced, so first of all, complicated constitutional monarchy, one in which a council of state exerted, so regular elections, you know, in which liberals and conservatives traded power. The emperor could put some thumb on the scale, but there were free and fair elections with a limited franchise, you know, and so there were rotations in power that led to different kinds of legislation being adopted, not all of which proposed by the emperor. But the point I would make here is, even if the emperor did have that power, which I think he didn't completely, he was subject to the constraint of the private slave owning elite, the large slave owners who were growing coffee in São Paulo, Rio region, for example, at this time. And so that was the real constraint on the monarchy. And so abolitionist legislation led to the fall of the monarchy, you know, the abolition in 1889. But though I think slave owners were aware, and this is something we're trying to get more evidence on, but certainly aware of what was happening in individual decisions by the Supreme Court and stuff, in general, the actions of the judicial bureaucracy, particularly at lower levels, were not as observable, not as cohesive, and, you know, difficult to come by data on the rates at which freedom cases were being decided. So that's why I think the emperor faced a legislative constraint, even if the legislator would have done and why the bureaucratic path was more appealing. Yes, thank you. I'm sorry, I have Susan.
Good question, hopefully, and thanks for the talk. It sounded to me like you were making a sort of analogy to Chilean state formation. That may or may not be correct, but I was wondering if you could sort of spin that out a little bit and say more about if undoing slavery is making a state, then which state is being made? So is it the Portuguese state, or are you making an argument that this was something durable that was going to stay around, and it's actually made the Brazilian state that we are talking about today?
I mean, I think part of the answer is, and this certainly speaks more, thank you for the question, and for coming. I think part of this speaks to the judicial, to the rule of law. So the judicial bureaucracy part certainly speaks to that. That's where there's some consonance with the interesting work that Franco Vimalco has done in Mexico. But I think the same kind of process emerged in response petitions or claims made by marginalized persons from below. And the elite conflict also drove a similar kind of responsiveness, with some important differences in the details. But that is a remarkable, even if a highly unjust form of the rule of law, it's remarkable reading these cases, and there's been some historical work looking at this as well, and the extent to which the rule of law was in place. And so that's one form of state building. But also the nature and scope of the bureaucracy, the idea that expert witnesses, trustees, a whole host of folks would have to be brought in to respond to these petitions, and often respond to them in what I think, at least I find surprising ways. And that was true of the carceral bureaucracy too. So, the state was a varied beast, but we sometimes tend to see things in O'Donnell's eyes, perhaps a little bit more. I mean, and to be fair, O'Donnell was talking about brown areas, in his words, that served marginalized persons as opposed to green and blue areas, so, areas that served wealthier populations. But these are certainly bureaucracies serving the most marginalized of persons. And so I think that variation has been underappreciated and was an important part of the construction of a responsive bureaucracy governed by the rule of law, basically, in a situation where it seems to me, very surprising.
Thanks, Matt, for this presentation. So the first question I had is a clarification one. When you are speaking about state building, is it the central state based in Rio de Janeiro that you're focused on? Yes.
Yeah, although it's but the emperor is appointing, and through his delegates, appointing bureaucrats throughout the country. So these cases, and there's a very interesting archive I'm starting to work in Maranhão, where in San Luis, in the capital of Maranhão, where they've been aggregated, bringing to San Luis all of the judicial records from the outlying courts. So this was a federal proposition. There's been work on Bahia and cases in Bahia and so on. So these bureaucrats were appointed at the highest levels by either directly by the emperor or by a provincial president who was appointed by the emperor.
Okay, so here's the follow-up.
Okay.
I think it would be interesting to think about, okay, what are the implications of the findings that you have for the building, what we know about how state capacity was built, particularly in the immediate aftermath during the First Republic of the period that you're studying, because the traditional interpretation is we had a very weak central government. You had very strong regional powers. This is the Café con Leche Republic, right? And so I don't know if your evidence, so far, it seems like most of the evidence was about building up a central government power, goes against that traditional interpretation, or you want to show that part of this empowerment of these local bureaucracies at these state levels is part of what explains why these republics, these states during the First Republic were so powerful. So I think it depends what you're observing in terms of state capacity at the central level versus the subnational states. But I think there's a contribution to be made about what we know of state capacity in the First Republic. The second question that I have has to do with this argument that state building goes against elites. And I think you're showing that it goes against certain kinds of economic elites, but this is a period where Brazil is rapidly modernizing. It's the takeoff of Brazilian, very incipient industrialization, but you're starting to have these other elites with alternative economic interests, just like you did in the United States. And so the question is, do you see these bureaucracies as maybe being supported or aligned with other economic elites? And so it's a little bit more complicated story than the state simply going against economic elites, but rather it's kind of siding in this incipient distributive conflict.
Yeah, thank you for the great questions and for coming. The first question is really great, but I really have thought of that as a kind of legacy question. I mean, I thought of the republic as kind of really smashing the monarchy in many ways. Certainly there are important continuities, but in particular after abolition, this constraint on legislation just isn't there in the same way. And so while I think there could be interesting consequences to look at, and I think the point about regionalism is a good one, really good one. But I think, the working presumption has been that after 1889, there's a different kind of political equilibrium. So here, just trying to focus on the construction of the state bureaucracy in imperial Brazil in the 19th century. but it's a great thing to think more about. In terms of other elites, I think it's absolutely true that Brazil is starting to industrialize the railroads in the even in the late imperial period, and the other kinds of incipient industrializations that were at play. But one thing that's really striking is the extent to which slavery and enslaved persons played a role in every single industry. That it's and thinking about urban slavery too, and Esclavos de Ganho, the idea that sometimes associated with work on economic development of the South in the US, the idea that industrialization was held back because of the demands of a agricultural economy that was based on slavery. Certainly may be true for the US case, but the very creative ways, I say that, not as a positive thing, the very creative ways in which slavery was deployed in Brazil, I think a little bit gives the lie to that. There are all kinds of urban service economy jobs that were performed by enslaved persons. Slaves were in the mines. Slaves were in the coffee fields. Slaves were involved in all kinds of transport between cities. So industrialization, there's nothing per se, I think, that would limit the role of slavery in industrialization. Actually, so I think that even the new elites, had the same kinds of interests in perpetuating a slave owning economy. So that's why I don't think it's so much a story of one set of private elites against another, but rather the autonomy of the state against private slave owning elites. I mean, it was a complicated thing for the central state too. The central state was reaping revenue, of course, from the export taxes that those slave owning elites were generating, and the central government owned slaves, although many were liberated over time. The crown had slaves. So former slaves had slaves. The entire economy was run on the basis of slave labor. And so that's what makes things a little bit complicated. It's not like there's a sector that's completely divorced from slave labor, but there was a way in which the state became more autonomous of the large plant. It's in this way that I'm arguing here. Thank you.
So thanks for a fantastic talk and great project. It connects with Jasmine's question about, I'm trying to understand if there is a conflict between elites, in fact, between pro and anti-slavery elites, or is more declining and weakening of traditional slave owning elites. So my question was similar around the lines of were there any particular market incentives or revenue generating incentives that would force empower and incentivize other types of more, say, market oriented elites to advocate for freedom of slaves, or was rather the tension between slave owning and a more autonomous state against those elements? And a quick different question, whether the police chiefs mediating these conflicts played any kind of a brokerage role. I don't know if your data can illustrate that, but in this Janus-faced role, do they adjudicate based on principle, ideology, or what is going on in terms of how they make their decisions?
Those are both great questions and ones I've thought about a little bit. Thanks for coming also. Yeah, I think on the first one, I think my answer would be kind of related to what I was just saying in terms of the deep penetration and importance of slavery in every sector. It's the state, in fact, was cutting itself off from revenue generating opportunities in limiting the role of slavery. And indeed, this is only under, in some sense, there's some elements that are partially exogenous to the story here, I guess you could say, in that, for example, the pressure towards abolition that led to the abolition of the slave trade, first formally in 1831 and then effectively in 1850, was very much, it was undeniable that British influence was really important, naval blockades and what have you, and that was a kind of a force that was pointing in the direction, along with maybe Dom Pedro Sigmundo's imagination of himself as a modern person, wedded to science and all this. There were kind of forces that would have pushed him in a more abolitionist direction. But I don't think it was so much the market conflict. I don't think it was the revenue generating market elite that had anti-slavery attitudes in this case, to quite the same extent as maybe some other cases in the Americas. And then the police chief, variation in police chiefs and decisions of police chief is really something I hope to study in this project. It's very hard to get at. What we do see, I mean, the chiefs of police were appointed by the emperor. Sometimes they were actually appeals judges themselves, as embajadores. So they had this influence and tended to engage in these kinds of decisions that we're seeing in the data in this period. But looking at the variation across, say, different chiefs of police and how that mapped onto background and whatnot, that's really hard. I think it would be really interesting. But we haven't been able to do that yet.
So thanks, Dad. This is a great talk. Lots of food for thought. Let me get back to one question that Susan had raised about the specific sector that you're looking into, which is the judiciary. So there's many pathways to the development of autonomous state capacity. And a lot of the literature that you cite really speaks to autonomous state capacity in different sectors, economic policymaking or central bank autonomy, or even the military. And here, it is the judiciary. Maybe some institutions within the judiciary or institutions that work with the judiciary, the police, the carceral system. So I want to push you a little bit on that question of the comparative trajectories, specifically because you are talking about the development of state capacity within the context of autocracy. So this is the question of developing state capacity in autocracy prior to democratization or prior to. Does it make a difference whether the military becomes autonomous vis-a-vis the judiciary, vis-a-vis economic policymakers, vis-a-vis central bank? I think it would be very helpful. I don't know if for the book project, but for many of us, just to get your thoughts on that comparative trajectories.
Those are great questions and food for thought. Thank you also for coming to the talk very much. I think that autonomy, I really had in mind because of the centrality of economic elite and slave owning elite power in this period, kind of the autonomy of organs of states from that power. And so some certain organs are going to be more important for that in terms of that autonomy than others. Certainly the judiciary and the police are real central. But the extent to which those organs are autonomous of the emperor is not the sort of thing that I'm thinking about. And so I guess that maybe one runs the risk in making references to the contemporary period, because I think that's not the sense of, say, Evans and embedded autonomy, for example. And so I think that speaks to the question about the military. The military is there working. In a complicated way, and it depends which military you're thinking about it, which period, but more or less the of the environment. So could therefore, though, engage in very much seigneurial state kind of behavior. And so, yeah, there might be delegation across organs where one organ is more seigneurial and another organ is more autonomous. I think that certainly could be true, but that's also why I thought that the evidence of autonomy from slave owning interests in the carceral system was particularly surprising. It's kind of a hard case for that, because you would think, like the military, that would be more the repressive arm of the state, and sometimes it was. It absolutely was. But sometimes it wasn't. So I found it interesting. So thanks. I'll think more about that.
Anyone?
Thanks for the presentation. This is a very exciting project as usual. I am trying to figure out what is the story, the theoretical story about state building that you are developing here, right? And I can imagine two possible stories that are theoretically contrary, but not necessarily contradictory, maybe. So one is a very classic Marxist story about the relative autonomy of the state, in which you say, well, we have this state that developed relative autonomy. At the end of the day, these spaces of protections of rights were able to
create some legitimacy for slavery and eventually preserve the hegemony of slavery until the whole thing collapsed. And you could argue that foundation of the relative autonomy of the states then went on to serve Brazil for other purposes in the 20th century. So that's one possible story that would be very classic in some way. The other story is a very liberal story in theoretical terms. It is not so much the story about economic development that Jasmine and Andres were exploring, but rather a story about the heterogeneity of bureaucracies, in the sense of you have different social groups going into the different bureaucracies, particularly in the judiciary, right? You have the letter population being co-opted into the judiciary. And I could imagine that, therefore, and we see in different segments of the judiciary, you see different values and policy preferences, right? Of course, we see this in modern states as well. We have seen, right, the more and more lawyers in more states focusing on human rights issues. In the US, the government now argues that we have democratic bureaucracies, and so we have this kind of heterogeneity. But also you could think about heterogeneity over time. And so by the 1830s, right, most of Latin America is dismantling the slavery system. By the late 19th century, the US Civil War has happened. So you could imagine that the letter bureaucracy, the letter class in Brazil is changing its perspective about the role in the world as well. That would be a very different story than the first one, right? So clearly you find an exciting story underlying this evidence. So I'm curious about what is the theoretical story that you want to tell?
Thank you. Those are great questions, and thanks for coming. I really appreciate it. I think the classic Marxist view, has some merit in this setting. I think the idea that essentially is the idea of the seigneurial state in some ways, like the state is the executive committee, not of the executive committee, not of the bourgeoisie, but of the slave owning elite. And there's indeed some literature, non-Marxist, perhaps, and Marxist literature that looks at the language of voluntary manumissions and alleges that it was exactly that. It was part of reinforcing the system over time, was basically the grant of beneficence, manumission to some enslaved persons, and that would provide also an incentive after a long life and undergird the whole system, and so there's something to that. But the degree to which conflict over manumission erupted quite early, I think gives a little bit of a lie to that story of retaining the legitimacy of the system through manumissions. In fact, I mean, these are decisions that are going quite directly against the expressed wishes, sometimes expressed quite virulently, of the slave owner class. So it's not, so I think there's some role for that kind of Marxist or neo-Marxist interpretation, but I don't think it covers the gamut of the empirical territory. Now it's even not maybe the most important part of it. And then in terms of heterogeneity of judges and maybe the changing liberal ideals, I mean, I think that's right. I think it's hard to understand heterogeneity. Certainly one can, and we're working on kind of mapping the backgrounds of judges who are making decisions, but of course that only gives us kind of some purchase over what was inspiring them individually to move in a more liberal direction. Therefore, I think what's more promising is to think about patterns of movement through the bureaucracy and appointments as axes of change, which is really, that's a theoretical story I want to tell here. So it's sort of like, how does change happen through the bureaucracy, and why does it happen in the way that it does, given the political constraints that the emperor was facing? And while I think that's very much a story about 19th century Brazil, I think it has, as I was kind of saying at the end, I think it has broader implications for understanding the patterns of state building and comparative perspective. So I guess that's what I would kind of say about it. But it's hard, the question of heterogeneity is interesting, individual heterogeneity.
Right. Very thought-provoking talk. Two questions. I'm curious about your choice of terms, the deep state. We hear about the deep state a lot in the media. I just wonder what your thinking is, and adopting that term in this particular context. But then a lot of questions has been about the bureaucratic responsiveness. What I hear you say is you want to understand bureaucratic behavior in some sense. Why is it going in this particular direction? So, I study a bit of bureaucracy in the context of corruption. And in that context, we want some oversight. We don't want autonomy of bureaucracies necessarily from that perspective of checks and balances. I just wonder about what are the forces that are pulling bureaucracies in this more progressive or liberal direction in this context. Annibal's question about heterogeneity, what are the different forces? One could imagine bureaucracy being captured by some of the traditional interests pulling in that direction as well. So I'm curious what your thinking is.
Yeah, those are great questions. Thank you so much. And I apologize if the language of deep state caused any PTSD out there. It's not. It's really for deep TSD, but during but the idea is really how this administrative state acts to make policy. And of course, that's the current allegation about bureaucracy works from a certain political perspective, but it's also true in general that the administrative state may shape policy. And so Scott kind of famously once wrote that policy was made not in the legislature, but in its implementation. What I think is interesting about this, while that's true here, it's also the case that implementation made policy, but the policy couldn't be immediately made, but that the bureaucracy was kind of a trial room policy is what I'm basically ultimately alleging. I mean, I think I allege it with some caution because I think this work is ongoing and these are hypotheses that are still in need of more further verification, but just kind of based on what we've done and seen so far, what I've done and seen so far, I think that's right. So that's why the deep state, in terms of what's pushing the bureaucracy in this direction, I mean, it really is the emperor. And the emperor, as I say, the emperor is subject to these exogenous pressures, the British naval blockade, the respect for the idea that it's a part of the progressive scientific elite, progressive in that sense, in the 19th century sense, elite, and familiarity with the currency of abolitionist thought elsewhere. So different bureaucrats came to these questions with different priors, if you will, different backgrounds. Some of them came from big slave owning families, some of them didn't. Murilo Carvalho emphasizes, he does a lot of work on the backgrounds of magistrates, and he did in his work, and shows that a lot of them came from elite strata, but not necessarily coffee barons or sugar barons. There was a lower strata in general, but then there was heterogeneity. So it's absolutely the case that some of the bureaucracy could have been captured by, say, big slave owning interests. Nonetheless, the hypothesis is that patterns of promotion and reward in the bureaucracy also pushed bureaucracy as a whole in the direction more of the pro-freedom direction. And that was really the emperor.
Thank you, Todd, for the very exciting talk. I am not an expert in Brazil and I'm not a historian, but I was wondering a little bit, thinking about like everybody else in comparison. You mentioned that manumission in Brazil was more extensive, and I was wondering more extensive than what? Because in my brain, thinking about sort of the end of slavery in Colombia, even the United States, it came 20, 50 years, 20, 30 years earlier, right? And I was wondering, as you were talking about these mechanisms, if these weren't mechanisms that actually prolonged the existence of slavery, just because it never created the kind of clash that would eventually lead to the Civil War in the US and to a radical policy by liberals in Colombia in the 1850s. But this might be because I misunderstood what you meant by extensive manumission. The other question was about the story that is being told here, in terms of like state building. And I was wondering if this is also not a story about two different ways of building the state, right? Which is, so we have this idea that the state can be built by war, and repressive apparatus, right? The strengthening of the repressive apparatus for one reason or another. But really the story you're trying to tell here is, well, this is a story about a strengthening of bureaucracy in the fight against sort of slavery. And I was wondering about what kind of consequences would that have later on? Like, could these explain like differences in how we observe state capacity or sort of the characteristics of the state in the 20th century in Latin America or in America as well, probably?
Yeah, thanks for those great questions and for coming. I definitely, so manumission being more extensive, so I didn't present data on that. It's a little bit difficult to measure. Sources vary, but very clear from the censuses and from other sources in Brazil that compared to, say, North America, US, but also to other places in the Americas that manumission was much more prevalent. So you had in cities in the 19th century, even by the mid 19th century, where the plurality of the population was free people of color. And so the enslaved person class was smaller, in fact. And so that's quite interesting, I think, in view of the observation that, yes, Brazil was a laggard, Brazil was the last to pass formal abolition. But on the other hand, manumission, partially voluntarily, partially enforced by the bureaucracy, lots of mechanisms that led to greater manumission, led to a social setting that was quite different than, say, in North America. And so with a much bigger freed person of color class. And so abolition legislatively, Brazil was a laggard, but if you think about it in terms of manumission as it moved towards abolition, it was the opposite. And so it's that tension between formal abolition and policy advanced by other means that I think is interesting and that I'll try to explore and explain here. And then, yeah, in terms of the story of state building, I mean, I guess it would be, it's first of all, I have very much in mind the notion of autonomy as a component of state capacity, autonomy of private elites. So it's sort of the non-Marxist version of the state, but also basically in some way or another infrastructural power. I mean, I think it comes down to that in some ways, because I think the state is providing a forum in which even marginalized persons can appeal. And it's not, it would be a stretch to say equal treatment under the law, very much not so, but it's a point in that direction, And so that's a really important part of state capacity, is what I would say. So there's one more question.
Yes, okay, so we're out of time. Okay, so
We're out of time. Okay,
maybe unless we collect a few,
Sure.
Yeah, so Marai, then Rashid, you don't know your name, and someone else.
Thank you, Dad. I had a couple of thoughts and inspired what you just last said about the role of autonomy, because in my mind, like Masuka's framework could actually be very helpful to you to frame like the place of autonomy, because autonomy is part of the state formation dimension that Masuka has, and to the extent that for him it's the relationship between the central elites and the elites in the periphery, and how whether the state subordinates them or like brokers deals with them. So autonomy is kind of like part of that process of state formation. And on the other hand, when he distinguishes between autonomy, between formation and state building, like in state building, like that is like the capacity of the state to provide like services. And the rule of law that you are mentioning is part of it, part of the state capacity side of the story. So like for me, like it makes sense what you are doing and trying to like study at the role of state autonomy and then how the rule of law is implemented. And the second question that I had was more about like the role of the parallels that we can make between the bureaucracy being responsive to the demands of these marginalized groups, in this case, slaves, but also to the demands of like other populations that were marginalized in that period, like rural dependence, for instance. I was thinking a lot about the parallels between like the landowners not enabling like rural dependents to unionize, for instance. And what can you tell us about like the role of the rural dependents vis-a-vis the slaves in Latin America?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks, Professor Danny. This is very fascinating. We just have two quick comments. As we are talking, there's a lot of African historiography from African colonialism that may be useful for you, especially for settler colonies under the British Empire, in terms of the state or the colonial state having to battle between the settlers and the African population that's quite similar to this. So that might be useful as well. But my second question was about the role of the church, especially when it comes to the judiciary. I was just curious, is this ecclesiastical courts? How is this undoing of the state occurring as a church versus state, separating also in relation to the metropole as well? So just looking to learn about what the role of the church in this.
Thank you.
No, I think my question was already addressed. So that's fine.
This talk has Brazil at the center, right? But you also are trying to make a statement about Latin America in general, and the Americas in general, right? The point, though, is that the periods in which the abolition of slavery occurred are vastly different, right? So Cuba, US, and Brazil fit in sort of one pattern. But then you have the mid-century pattern, the 1848 moment. And then you have countries that freed slaves immediately, and that is particularly in Chile, right? Immediate freedom of slavery, immediate citizenship. And so there are these very different patterns. And one of them that strikes me as completely missing from the talk is what is the relationship between slaves and the military? Now remember that slaves were part of the army that freed Chile. And so that's not surprising, right? That Chile would abolish slavery so early. Aside from the fact that there's no tropical agriculture, right? But then you have also the civil wars. And so, for instance, in Colombia, of course, there were blacks and whites or Colombians of all stripes fighting on different sides of these civil wars. And so 1848 seems like a very good period in which to abolish slavery when you have these kinds of participation in the civil war kind of things. So all of those things I think are elements that completely are extraneous to your vision. But
You want me to say anything?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
What are you? What are your famous last words?
I mean, I would have a lot, I would like to say a lot about each of these excellent points. Maybe we can talk afterwards. Maybe we can talk afterwards, because if I get into it, it'll take me 10 minutes, because these are great points, and I want to address them all and let you is owed them. So thanks. I'll think about them more.
Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah.